Hi everyone, this is DM Yeknam from House Rule Gamers again. This time we're going to look at magic in the AD&D 2nd Edition game system and how it is cast and how it is used. So spells in the AD&D game, be it 1st Edition or 2nd Edition, in this case 2nd Edition, as we're referencing from Chapter 7 of the 2nd Edition AD&D Player's Handbook, are some of the most powerful things in the game. However, the vast majority of characters and non-player characters encountered in the game cannot actually use magical spells. Yes, rangers and paladins have a limited use of spells, but it is almost exclusively the realm of wizards and priests. So we're going to quickly discuss wizards here. Wizards may have had the natural ability to learn spells. Wizards may have had a tutor. They may have been part of an academy. The exact details of how they learn their magic should be up to the player and the dungeon master, and they should discuss briefly at character creation how such things came about. We do need to emphasize that a wizard learning a spell and learning magic is a very complicated and time-consuming ordeal that most individuals in the campaign world neither had the aptitude nor the time to accomplish. The same can be said about priestly magic. Many people didn't have the aptitude to devote themselves to the hours upon hours of prayer, to the types of ethos and beliefs that the religious system espoused, or they didn't have the opportunity to be able to do so. Wizards must use spellbooks. The exact dimensions and size of these spellbooks really should be up to the dungeon master and the player character. But they are almost always something that is difficult to carry around, and wizards can only learn spells that they know. Typically, this would be within one of their spell books that the wizard owns. Sometimes they may encounter another spell book that has spells they know. And when a wizard encounters a new spell, in order to learn that spell, two things must be met. One, the first requirement is that they must be of high enough level to cast that spell. Secondly, they must be able to learn the spell. A specialist wizard cannot learn a spell from a school that they oppose, and other wizards must make their chance to know spell as based off of their intelligence, which is from Table 4, and you can see Table 4 in our video on ability scores, but the wizard must succeed at their role to learn new spells. Memorization of a spell requires a wizard to be fully rested and to have time to memorize a spell. It takes 10 minutes per spell level per spell for a wizard to memorize spells. So a first level spell takes 10 minutes. Memorizing 2 first level spells would require 20 minutes. Memorizing 2 7th level spells would require 140 minutes. A wizard cannot memorize spells for more than an 8-hour time frame. Part of a wizard's intellect can be seen in the spells that they choose to memorize for their daily use, or the spells that they keep in memory to help them overcome what they expect to be the obstacles they'll be facing within the next day or so. Spells remain memorized until they are cast, in which point they are wiped from a wizard's memory, or until a wizard has something that causes spells to disappear from their memory. Some magics can steal spells from a wizard's memory. Some things that are very traumatic and traumatizing to characters, such as being reduced to below 0 hit points, can also wipe the memory of spells from a character's memory. Now, we're not going to go into great detail on the schools of magic. This should be something that players and dungeon masters should guide one another into the understanding of the actual schools of magic. But there are 9 schools of magic. We're going to briefly say that they are abjuration, alteration, conjuration, summoning spells, enchantment, charm spells, greater divination spells, which are not to be confused with lesser divination spells. Lesser divination spells are spells that all wizards can cast and tend to be only up to a certain power level of spells. Illusions, which we are going to discuss in somewhat greater detail later in this video. Invocation, evocation magic, and necromantic magic. Now, with that said, let's go ahead and move on to learning spells. Learning spells. Now, whether a character chooses to be a mage or a specialist mage in one of the schools of magic, they must learn spells from somewhere. It might be possible for the exceptional wizard to learn the secrets of arcane lore entirely on their own. It's very unlikely, though. This is one of those things that you have to discuss with your DM. If you truly wish a wizard to begin their career without having had a tutor, discuss that with your dungeon master, and the arrangements will be made necessary for what fits best in the campaign you'll be part of. It is, however, far more likely that your character was apprenticed to another wizard. The wizard that you were apprenticed to, their personality is again up to your dungeon master and yourself. Perhaps your character even studied at a proper wizardly academy, if such things exist in the game world. Wherever your character learned your magic spells, there is a limit to the number of spells you will begin with. The limit is typically determined by your dungeon master and may be something that the player is allowed to choose, or may be something the player randomly rolls for. There will always be a limit to the number of first level spells you know, and it will never exceed the maximum number of spells that your character can know for your character's intelligence. When your character attains a new level, they may or may not receive new spells. This is up to the dungeon master. The dungeon master may allow your character to return to their mentor and add a few spells to their book. It may be possible for your character to copy spells from the spellbook of another spellbook or player character that you have encountered. Or you might have to wait until you can just find a brand new spellbook to learn such things. There may also be a set of training rules that exist in your campaign that your DM should have informed you of before game begins or gameplay begins. In all cases, before a new spell can be added to the spellbook, the character must check to see if they can learn the spell. Now, we're going to briefly touch on illusions here, because illusions are somewhat difficult to adjudicate in the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons game, as they are really in any sort of game that uses magic. Now, illusions really need the cooperation of both the dungeon master and the player character, as sometimes vocabulary will escape either the dungeon master or the player character in describing the illusion, and therefore we have to create a suspension of disbelief based off of other things that are happening in game. Spells of the illusion school really fall into two basic groups. They are illusions that create or manipulate light, color, shadow, sound, and sometimes even scent, with higher level illusions tapping into energy from other planes that really create quasi-real things being woven of extra dimensional energies by the caster. Common illusions create appearances. They cannot make a creature or object look like nothing, but they can conceal objects by making them look like something else. Phantasms exist only in the minds of their victims, and these are the other common types of illusions. These spells are never even quasi-real, although to the victim they appear to be entirely real. Phantasms act upon the mind of the victim to create an intense reaction, with fear being the most common of such reactions. The key to successful illusions or phantasms is believability, which depends really on three main factors: what the caster attempts, what the victim expects, and what is happening the moment the spell is cast. By combining the information from all these three areas, the player and the DM should be able to create and adjudicate reasonable illusions and phantasms. When casting an illusion or phantasm, the caster can attempt to do anything he desires within the physical limits of the spell. Prior knowledge of the illusion created is not necessary, but is extremely useful in creating the narrative that will help the illusion really help everyone suspend disbelief and create the narrative for the illusion that we want everyone to understand. The type of illusion chosen by the caster affects the reaction of the victim. If the victim pretty much has no reason to believe that a troll would magically appear in front of them, then it may be easier for them to disbelieve. If you are in an outhouse inside of a castle, then why should a troll suddenly come through the door if trolls are not even a common threat to the castle itself? Now, the next most important thing to ask about the spell is what the victim expects. Which of these two illusions would be more believable? A huge dragon rising up behind the rank of attacking kobolds, which are small, puny little creatures, or a few ogres forming a line behind the kobolds. Most adventurers would find it hard to believe that a dragon would be working with kobolds, although not unnecessarily so, especially if rumors of such things existed in the area. The dragon is usually far too powerful to associate with such little creatures. Ogres, however, could work very well with kobolds, bossing them around and using them as cannon fodder. The key to a good illusion is to create something the victim does not expect, but could quickly accept. An exceptionally easy to believe illusion would be that of a solid wall in a dungeon, transforming a passage into a dead end. Unless the victim is very, very familiar with these hallways and the dungeon in particular, they would have no reason not to believe that the wall is there. Of course, in a fantasy world, many more things can be believed than in the real world. Flames do not spring out of nowhere in the real world, but this can happen in a fantasy world. The presence of magic in a fantasy world makes victims more willing to accept things that real-world logic tells us cannot happen. A creature appearing out of nowhere could be an illusion, or it could be summoned. At the same time, you must remember that a properly role-played character is familiar with the laws and expectations of their world. If a wall of flames appears out of nowhere, they would look for the caster. A wall blocking a corridor may cause them to check for concealed, hidden, or secret doors. If the illusion doesn't conform to their idea of how things work, the character should rightfully be suspicious. This is something that the dungeon master and the player character have to work out. This then, of course, truly leads to the third factor in the believability of an illusion: how appropriate the illusion is for the situation, as I mentioned briefly before. The best illusions reinforce the expectations of the average character's understanding of their situation or their area that they find themselves in. What could you do that would reinforce what the orcs might already believe? They see your group armed and ready for battle. They do not know if you are alone or if you're the advanced guard for a bigger troop. A good illusion could be the glint of metal and spear points coming up behind your party, subtly having its use in this case. The orcs would likely interpret your illusion as reinforcements for your group, at least enough to discourage them from attacking immediately. Now, remember, the limitations of each spell must be considered when attempting to use an illusion. Illusions that are exceptionally well prepared and fit all of the circumstances might warrant a penalty to any saving throw allowed. Illusions that are very ill prepared and do not fit the situations very well may, offer a bonus to any saving throws. So it's best to be thoroughly prepared when using illusions and perhaps discuss them before the campaign begins and every so often throughout the campaign with your dungeon master to make sure that both you and your dungeon master are on the same page when it comes to illusions. Now let's quickly move on to discussing pre-spells. While they sometimes may seem similar to wizard spells, they're truly quite different in their overall tone. A priest role is as a defender and guider for others, typically for those who are of their faith or that their faith would wish to guide and protect or that their faith would wish to bring into as part of their faithful flock. Like the wizard, the priest level determines how many spells the priest may retain. They must select their spells in advance, demonstrating their wisdom and farsightedness by choosing spells which they think would be the most useful in the trials that lurk ahead. Unlike the wizard, the priest needs no spellbook and does not need to roll to see if they learn spells. A priest may encounter unique or new spells that are in the form of prayers that they have never seen before. And of course, there's a method for priests to learn such spells, but this is not nearly as common as what it is for wizards. Priests also are only able to access those spells which are offered by their deity. The spells offered by a deity are typically known as divine or spheres of influence, the divine spheres of influence. These different spheres of influence are briefly discussed Under Priest of Specific Mythoi in Chapter 3, we discussed them much further in our video on Specialty Priest. Within the major spheres of a deity, a priest can usually gain any spell of any level that they are an appropriate level of, to cast. When we're dealing with spheres of minor access, a priest is typically limited to third level spells or lower, as long as they themselves are high enough level to cast that level of spell. Priest must pray to obtain their spells, as they are requesting their abilities from some greater power, be it their deity or some intermediary agent, some philosophy, some established church. The conditions for praying are truly identical to those needed for the wizard. They must be fully rested. It requires them 10 minutes per spell level to memorize. Thus, a 5th level spell would require 50 minutes. There are additional things that need to be understood. The DM has probably decided that not all deities are equal. Now, if all deities are equal, then what I'm about to say is irrelevant. Or if you were only in a world where philosophies exist and all philosophies are equally powerful, or only churches of ideals exist and all such churches are equally powerful, then what we're about to discuss is irrelevant and doesn't apply. But if you are in a world where these things are not equal, those things that are equivalent to demigod status can only grant up to 5th level spells. Lesser deities and those things that are the equivalent can only grant up to 6th level spells. And anything of intermediate or greater level equivalency for deities would grant 7th level spells, or things that you may later find out are even more powerful than 7th level spells. Now, we also must remember that a priest wizard will, a priest wisdom, not a priest wizards, a priest's wisdom may grant them additional bonus spells. If your wisdom is 13 or higher, you gain bonus spells, but those bonus spells are only available to a priest when the priest is able to cast a spell of that level. And you must also have a minimum wisdom to cast certain levels of priest spells. If your wisdom is not equal to the minimum required for those levels of spells, then you cannot cast those spells. Okay then, let's talk about casting spells itself. Both wizards and priests use the exact same rules for casting spells. To cast a spell, they must have the spell memorized. If it's not memorized, the spell cannot be cast. The caster must be able to speak, unless there is no verbal component for the spell, and have both arms free. Note that the optional spell components rule following can modify these conditions, and we will talk about optional spell components in just a moment. If the spell is targeted on a person, place, or thing, the caster must be able to see that target. It is not enough to cast a fireball 150 feet ahead into the darkness. The caster must be able to see the point of explosion and the intervening distance. Likewise, a magic missile, which always hits its opponent, cannot be fired into a group of bandits with the instruction to strike the leader. The caster must be able to identify and see the leader. Once the casting has begun, the character must stand still. Casting cannot be accomplished while riding or a roughly moving beast or vehicle, unless special efforts are made to stabilize and protect the caster. Thus, a spell cannot be cast from the back of a galloping horse under any conditions, nor can a wizard or priest cast a spell on the deck of a ship during a storm. However, if the caster were below decks and protected from the wind and surging waves, a spell could most likely be cast. It's not normally possible to cast a spell from a moving chariot, but a character who is steadied and supported by others could possibly do so. Your DM will have to make a ruling in these types of extraordinary conditions. During the round in which the spell is cast, the caster cannot move to dodge attacks. Also, they typically cannot move at all during that round. Therefore, no AC benefits from dexterity are gained by spellcasters while casting spells. Furthermore, if the spellcaster is struck by a weapon or fails to make a saving throw against a spell or an effect, their concentration is disrupted and the spell is lost and fizzles out uselessly. There may be times where it will do more than just fizzle out uselessly, depending upon your DM and the situation specifically. Spellcasters are advised not to put themselves in harm's way while they are attempting to cast spells. That is not a wise decision to make. Now let's talk about spell components. A large number of people do have varying opinions on spell components. I myself am always a proponent of using spell components, specifically material components, but I do make it a point to make such components available for player characters. I believe that spell components are a sort of a balancing act for a certain number of spells. More expensive and rare material components often are applied to spells that otherwise would be a much higher level spell. If the optional rules are used, your dungeon master should have a means of access to such spell components and a listing of their availability, or at least a discussion with player characters on how they may obtain spell components. When your character casts a spell, it is assumed that they are doing something to activate the spell under the optional spell components rule. The character may utter a few words, wave their hand around a couple of times, wiggle their toes, swallow a live spider, throw some diamond dust in the air. But under the standard rules, you don't have to know exactly what that is. It's different under the spell component rules. Much of this should be answered by your dungeon master and by the spell itself. The actions required to cast a spell are divided into three groups: verbal, somatic, which means physical gestures, and material. Each spell description found in the later sections of the player's handbook list what combination of these components is needed to cast a spell. Verbal components require the caster to speak clearly, not be silenced in any way. Somatic components require free gestures, thus the caster cannot be bound or held. Material components must be tossed, dropped, burned, eaten, broken, or whatever for the spell to work. There's no specific description of the words and gestures that must be performed, because this would be utterly ridiculous. But there are ways that you can incorporate such things in your game without actually having the actual words. You can just assume that magic in and of itself is a unique set of words that are applied by each individual to each spell uniquely and differently. Do not really waste your time trying to create a proper magical language for your game. It will be one of those things that is far too difficult to implement and may put off many people from playing spellcasters. Now, material components are always listed in the spell description. Some of these are very easy and common to obtain and may even be reusable. Others represent items of great value or scarcity. Whatever the component, it is almost automatically destroyed or lost when the spell is cast, unless the spell description specifically notes otherwise. The spell component's optional rule is used in your campaign if you, as a player, and the rest of your group and your dungeon master agree upon this. In that case, your wizard or priest must have those items upon their person and some way to keep and take care of them. Not all things obviously must be kept and separated, but a live spider should not be mixed in with sand. Diamond dust should not be mixed in with sand, as it would be difficult to separate such things. There's a difference between fine-grained sand and maybe rough-hewn colored sand. All of these things, a sensible way to keep track of your components without the game becoming more taxing to your record keeping than is necessary for you and your group, needs to be arranged. For expensive and rare items, it is perfectly proper for your DM to insist that special efforts must be made to obtain these items. After all, you simply cannot assume your character has a valuable pearl handy whenever the character needs one. It just wouldn't be possible. The three different aspects of spell components also change the conditions under which your character may cast their spells. No longer do they need to be able to speak, move, and use some item. They only need to fulfill the required components. Thus, a spell with only verbal components could be used by a naked and bound spellcaster as long as they were able to speak. Only requiring gestures, a spell only requiring gestures, could be cast if the character was silenced. Most spells require a combination of components, but clever spellcasters often create new spells that need only a word or a gesture, enabling them to take full advantage and to take their enemies by surprise with their new and clever spells, which will lead us to our next topic, that of magical research. Magical research for spells. This is most often done by wizards, but should also be looked into by priests. Wizards wishing to create spells truly need to have a meaningful conversation with their dungeon master, and the dungeon master should have rules for such things to occur. The player's handbook only briefly touches upon this, as it leaves most of this up to the dungeon master, and the extensiveness and the details necessary will vary from campaign to campaign. One thing to note, wizards who are specialists in a school of magic typically cannot create a spell that comes from an opposing school of magic. Wizards should use existing spells to help determine the types of effects they can come up with, and the dungeon master will be the one who has the final say over such things. Priest should only be able to create magics that fall into the spheres of magic they have access to, and ideally that can help further the ethos of their faith. So next here, we're going to look at spell descriptions. Again, we're not going to go through all of the details. We are just going to say that you, as a player and your dungeon master, need to understand all of the different aspects of these spell descriptions, from name to the school of magic, the sphere of magic, the range, the components, the duration, casting time, area of effect, saving throw, and the spell's description. These should all be known by the player and the dungeon master so that you create a limited amount of time having to reference back to a book. Ideally, at least a minimum amount of notation will be made on your character sheet, your spell record, whatever you're using to record your character's abilities and the spells that your character can cast. This and the level of detail should be agreed upon by both the player and the dungeon master and the other players as well, because all players should be using at least a somewhat similar method of keeping track of their spells so that one player doesn't always have to consult a textbook while another player has all of the information readily available. Now, one final note about the descriptions of spells. It is important that you actually pay close attention to the description of the spell in the section where the spells are described. Reading simply the name of a spell can often create a misunderstanding that can cause minor disagreements and will always delay the progress of your game. One of the key things for your gaming in any game, not just AD&D 2nd edition, is making sure that you are making the game work for you and the individuals you are playing with. So understanding how a spell works, knowing that both the dungeon master and the player are on the same page with how the spell works, is essential to the speed and progress of your game. Now, before I sign off for this video, I'd like to take a partial quote from Terry Pratchett. All the Discworld books truly should be necessary reading for those of you who use fantasy games to enjoy your time and your leisure activities. It was octarine, the color of magic. It was alive and glowing and vibrant, and it was the undisputed pigment of the imagination. Because wherever it appeared, it was a sign that mere matter was a servant of the powers of the magical mind. It was enchantment itself. Thank you once again. This has been DM Yeknam from House Rule Gamers. Please like, subscribe, and share. And until next time, keep the magic flowing.